All right, so both clients connect to Mr. Napster. Mr. Napster then connects those two socket connections to each other, rather than anybody having to connect directly to one of the clients. Make sense? I think we used the example last class of somebody trying to get through this door if it only opened outwards and I'm standing on the other side. Okay, so last time we were talking about alternatives to client-server. We talked about BitTorrent. We talked about Napster. What else do we have along the peer-to-peer? There's a couple other ones that are similar to Napster, so we don't have to spend time talking about those. What are some of those? Just my name.
LimeWire, FrostWire.
LimeWire, FrostWire.
Yeah. LimeWire.
Who?
Kazaa.
Kazaa. Oh yeah.
I've heard that one a while.
What? Emui? How do you spell it? E-A?
No, M.
U?
L-E.
That? Oh, I've heard of that. Okay.
Have you really?
Yeah, I have. I just didn't understand it the way he was saying it. I don't know much about it, but I've heard of that. All right. So, any other alternatives to client-server stuff other than peer-to-peer options and BitTorrent type options?
Skype?
Okay. How?
It's kind of like.
Yeah, you could share files through Skype. I think that's fair. All right. Dropbox. Now, Dropbox, how might that work? Is that client server? So for instance, if I put some files up in the cloud inside my Dropbox folder, and then I send you a link, you're not downloading it from me, you're downloading it from the cloud, right? So I'm providing you the link, or I'm sharing the folder with you, so that anything we put inside that folder is shared amongst all of us. Isn't that still a client-server model? It's still a client-server model, probably. It does ultimately come down to how Dropbox's network is set up, whether they have some sort of distributed load balancing thing where maybe the Dropbox folders are duplicated 100 times, let's say. So this would be kind of how Google works. Google's data store technology for App Engine has your databases duplicated many times. And at all times they're duplicated. So whenever you connect and want data, it's going to send you to one of the duplicates that's least busy right now and feed you that data. It's the modern way of dealing with high performance databases as opposed to small footprint databases like our relational databases. So I don't know if I'd call Dropbox an alternative to client server. It's more of an example of client server. Anything else that goes on this list?
You could say client to client, but that was kind of an early peer-to-peer thing.
Okay. So it seems like in the middle here, there was a lot of technologies that were peer-to-peer stuff, utilizing this idea of having multiple clients connect to a central hub, and that central hub then connecting those clients directly with each other. Okay. The weakness of this was what? Was that if this guy was downloading a file from this guy, his download speed was only as fast as this guy's upload speed divided by the number of people directly connected to him. Right? So with things like Napster and LimeWire, you could choose how many simultaneous connections you would allow to be open to your machine at once. All right, so it was somewhat limited, right? So if you wanted to share your file, let's say 5 people could download it at once within reason. BitTorrent solves that by having everybody sharing the bits of their file all at once. The more the merrier, really, right? Really, the more the merrier, as long as the more have copies of the whole document or large chunks of the document. You don't want to have 2 seeders and 4,000 leechers. Okay, but BitTorrent spreads that wealth so that this guy is not just downloading his file from here, he's downloading part of it from here, part of it from here, and part of it from here. Taking advantage of a little bit of this guy's upload bandwidth, a little bit of this guy's upload bandwidth, and a little bit of this guy's upload bandwidth. Something like that. All right, now, last time when we talked about BitTorrent, we also mentioned that for BitTorrent, there's also a Mr. Torrent, somebody in the center, right? Okay, so somebody needs to have the initial seed put up there. And there are various sites that will host torrents for you. What's our popular one? Pirate Bay? Oh, who? ISO Hunt? Is that really? That's more popular than Pirate Bay?
No.
Okay, Pirate Bay keeps getting busted, right? Okay, they keep moving around and stuff like that. Now, something we talked about at the end of class last time is how do network administrators fight this? So, on one hand, they're trying to fight the battle of not having all of our bandwidth. So, if we're the network administrator here at Concordia, we're solving the problem of not having all of our bandwidth sucked up by students downloading torrent files, right? That isn't to say that all torrent files are bad, because there's perfectly legitimate reason to use BitTorrent. So we shouldn't associate the BitTorrent technology with illegal activity. It just happens to be leveraged often for illegal activity. Make sense? In fact, most of our modern day video games, when they release patches, are releasing it using a BitTorrent technology. That way you're not having to pull these huge patch files off a single server. So if we're looking at Concordia as an example, how could we block BitTorrent traffic? And let's take a step back even farther in history. When we were dealing with peer-to-peer things like Napster, I think we mentioned this last class, what we could do is we could block the IP address, right? So Concordia could say, okay, well, we're not going to allow any of our clients to create an outgoing connection to Mr. Napster's IP address. So what does Mr. Napster do? He just moves. Jumps IP addresses, right? Then I mentioned right at the end of class last time, once the network software got good enough that it could really track Mr. Napster, people started blocking ports. And what mechanism did things like Mr. Napster or Mr. LimeWire do to fake port blocking? Because one thing as a network administrator that we could do is we could say, okay, well, we are only going to allow our users to do web browsing and do email. Just say that as an example. Okay, many of us have had this issue on campus before, where you want to play video game XYZ and you have to talk to Mark Newhouse about getting a port opened because that's the communication port that game uses for all of its communication between Xbox Live or the other game clients, whatever it is. So on campus, let's just start off with the idea that only port 80 is open by default. Port 80 is the default HTTP protocol port. Okay, we mentioned a couple of classes ago when we were just looking at the web server stuff that we have common ports. Ports 0 through 1023 are taken by the operating system. Okay, so these are part of the standard. Port 80 is the standard HTTP port. Port 23 is the standard telnet port. 21 and 22, well, let's just say 21 for now, is FTP. So a couple of common ports. We have SSH2, we have IMAP, we have SMTP. But the one we're talking about right here is HTTP. So this is web stuff. So on campus, what if the network admin decided they were going to block all traffic on port 80? How much would that interfere with your computer usage? You couldn't open a web page. Any web page you go to is going to hit port 80. So is that a possibility for them to do on campus? If you're a network administrator, is that one of the possible solutions to the problem?
They don't have to. The Wi-Fi goes down by itself.
Port 80 along with all the other ports get blocked at random. Not an option, right? So what some of these tools like LimeWire and Napster, things that are not illegal in and of themselves, but were used for illegal purposes. Okay, that's kind of maybe the important thing to note here. There's nothing illegal about how Napster worked. It's how Napster was being used. Okay? So a lot of these peer-to-peer things started using port 80 as their communication channel. So that universities and other, well, I mean, it was real common amongst universities just because of demographic, right? A lot of the people who were doing the file sharing and file stealing happened to be college age, and they're centered in universities. So it's kind of the thing. So a lot of universities were trying to block the individual ports used by Napster, maybe port 8332 or something like that. Sometimes what would happen is when a communication channel was opened, when these two guys connected to Napster, it would then send back a port for you to actually communicate on. So it would actually randomly pick a port above 1024 and have you guys communicate on that port, but it would connect the dots for you. So now, if you're the university and you're positioning yourself in here, let's just draw a line. Okay, so you're the university who's putting this firewall right here. You can't just randomly block a single port because that port is a constantly moving target. Okay, so this guy might share one file over port 8332, and the next file he shares is over port 7118. Okay, so the university, what are they going to do? Just keep block anything above 1024 and cross their fingers and hope people don't scream? In many cases, that's what we do. That's what modern firewalls do. They block everything that's not a common port. And then they open up ports as needed. So how many of you have ever had to request a certain port be opened here on campus for something to work? Some game? Okay. Did you get a no answer or yes answer?
Sometimes I get no answer, sometimes I get yes answer, and sometimes I get no answer at all.
Okay. Well, so it keeps you guessing. What did you get?
It was 2 weeks till school ended, so they just kind of ignored me.
No. So no answer. You got the no answer version.
I'm pretty sure it was right like the day before we got DDoS, so they had bigger problems.
Yeah. Okay. So typically that's the case. What they do is they'll lock down the whole network and then wait for people to start squeaking. Okay. If they say, oh, this isn't working, then they'll look at what isn't working and decide if that is a legitimate use of network resources, and B, does opening that port make the network more vulnerable? Does that make sense? Or I guess it will make it more vulnerable. Is it worth the additional risk, the additional vulnerability? Okay, so that's one thing that they could have done, is blocked everything above a certain port, which they did. So that's why Mr. Napster, well, it probably actually wasn't at the Mr. Napster time, it was some of the future ones, they started using port 80 for all their communication. You know, universities could even block 21 or 23, right? No harm, no foul. I mean, how many of you in here have ever used Telnet? Couple. Okay, so most of us have not used port 23 on any machine. FTP, there's probably more of us, but there's probably a couple of us who've never used FTP. Or we at least didn't use an FTP client. We used some sort of web-based thing that did all the magic for us. So we didn't even know what we were doing. For our perspective, it was just web-based directory listings. Okay, so the university could realistically block all those, couldn't they? They could really block everything that's not email, so not the IMAP port 143, not SMTP, and not web. So as long as we do email and web, we're probably not going to complain too much. You know, then we also have some of the printer sharing ports, but actually a lot of the printers now have their own little web server running on them, so they actually connect through port 80 as well. Depends on the printer, but whatever. Let's just say that's the case. So at the very least, it's not an option for us to block port 80. When you think about the internet, the first thing we think about is web browsing, right? That's the internet in a lot of people's perspective. So you can't block it. So these peer-to-peer networks started using port 80 as their communication channel. What's a network administrator to do? So now I'm a network administrator, and I want to keep my bandwidth on campus from getting completely destroyed. Yet the technology that's being used on campus is utilizing port 80. I can't block the port without shutting down everybody's web browsing. Not an option. So what do you do?
give up to declare net neutrality.
How many of you? So that was the news yesterday, right? The net neutrality thing. It's interesting. For those of you who followed it, how many of you think they made the right decision, and how many of you think they made the wrong decision? It's a very interesting consumer-based question. So ultimately, what they did is the whole net neutrality argument was what? That places like Comcast, the network providers, wanted to have the ability to throttle data that wasn't being paid for. So they wanted places like Netflix. I like to use Netflix as just the example because that's a heavy user, right? They wanted, Comcast wanted Netflix to pay them a bunch of money so that Netflix's clients that were using Comcast network would be able to watch their movies. Okay, because Netflix was using a lot of their bandwidth. And the government said what? They said, no, you cannot throttle their data. So Comcast, you are not allowed to slow down Netflix bandwidth. And you also are not allowed to charge Netflix to not throttle their bandwidth. That's what they're, to simplify things, that's what they basically said yesterday, right? Okay, you can't choose who has fast access and who doesn't, and you're not allowed to charge them for it. Is that good or bad?
I think it's the right decision.
Okay,
Because
like where this is going.
because there isn't enough there isn't anywhere else to go.
Mm-hmm.
So you can't just say, oh, I don't like how you set this up, so I'm going to go over with these people over here.
Okay.
Because those people don't exist.
Okay, so as a consumer, you don't get the other option.
Yeah.
Okay, so then, see, now I don't like where you're going with it. Well, so let me give you my spin on it. The reason I said this is it becomes kind of a consumer issue. Let's say Comcast has this much bandwidth, and a big chunk of their bandwidth is being taken up by Netflix. Okay, well, they've sold internet connections to a whole bunch of customers, and those customers have an expectation of performance. Well, if Netflix continues to take up their bandwidth, what happens then? They don't even have to throttle. The end user's performance is going to go down. So who's going to have to start paying for the bill? Consumers. Okay? Just like the cellular plans, right? It's rare now to have a truly unlimited cellular plan. This is going to have a fallout into the cellular world too. Because even the companies that say they offer the unlimited cellular data, after 5 gigabytes or something like that, they have the right to keep data alive but minimize how much you can pull from it. So they throttle your data. So now the common packages, because most of the unlimited things people are kind of grandfathered into now. So the common things that you would buy today is you'd buy a data pack. You'd say, I'm going to pay for 15 gigabytes a month. You pay for what you get. And now the new trend is what? They're rolling over the data. So look, I paid for 15 gigabytes. If I didn't use it all, shouldn't I be able to have it for the next month? Sounds fair, right? You paid for it. But as home-based internet consumers, we're not used to paying for per gigabyte. We're used to saying, hey, I get up to this speed. Nowhere did it ever say that I only get so much. Actually, typically in the small print somewhere, it says you get a maximum like 50 gigabytes a month or something like that. Somewhere, but it's not something any of us read, so we would just deny it, right? Okay, so when we buy internet, we think of it as just being unlimited and have a maximum speed per second, right? Well, so if Netflix isn't going to foot the bill to make sure our movies come in fast, all of a sudden our internet bills are going to go up. How many of you would be happy with that? So where I thought you were going with this is, I do think it's the right decision they made. Doesn't it seem fair that we should pay for what we use? That seems fair. We don't like it. We don't like the idea of having to pay for what we use because we like having everything and paying for nothing. That's the ideal. That's the ideal situation, right? That's why we all knew about so many of these line wires and stuff like that. Okay, because that's the position we might be in. But it's not unfair to ask the consumer to pay for their internet. But we're not used to it. We don't want our bills to go up. We want our bills to go down. We want faster speed, lower bills. That's what we want. Yet Comcast has to pay for that bandwidth. Now, fine, Comcast has a lot of money, but they're also a for-profit company, so shouldn't they make their money? And, Amish's argument is, which is still a good argument, is that he doesn't have a choice. So even with this idea, regardless of what the decision was, my bill goes up, I don't really have an option to go to a different place. Here in town, I have two options. I have Time Warner. Oh, well, I guess three. I have Time Warner, and I have, well, it's still only two. Time Warner, I have AT&T. So I have DSL or cable. Those are my two options in this area. Okay? Two realistic options. Realistically, they're both going to be increasing their pricing, right? So I might be just dumping one evil for the other. It's the same thing. But as consumers, we can't shop around. We don't have that opportunity. If we don't like the price of the car we're interested in at Ford, we can go over to Honda and shop. We have several brands that we can look at, and they're all going to try to undercut each other, and we can end up getting the car that we liked, or at least the car that we liked for the price, whatever that is. We don't have that same world with our internet connections, right? So it's a very interesting decision that they made, because I think it is the most fair decision. I think it is the right decision, personal opinion. It's certainly the most neutral decision, but it does put the consumers at risk for higher bills. Because as consumers, wouldn't we rather Netflix pay the bill? Okay, and where I think this becomes really interesting is there's this whole movement, and I'm sure how many of you have heard have heard of it referred to as the cut the cord movement. Okay, so it started off with phones, right? How many of you still have a landline phone going into your house? I think just you, right? Okay.
Landline.
That's a landline. Okay, and that's just left over. They forgot to disconnect it. Well, how many of you are still on cable TV or Uverse or something like that at your house? Still many of us, right? A higher percentage of people still have some sort of paid television service at home than phone service. Because most of us have replaced our paid phone service at home with our cell phone that just travels with us wherever we are. But now it's becoming more and more common for people to cut the cord, stop paying the cable company, stop paying Uverse for that entertainment, because they can stream everything off the internet because they have unlimited data. They can, they have Netflix. They pay $8 a month and have a zillion movies and TV shows. Oh, but this certain show's not on there. Yeah, but these other 4 million are. So instead of paying $80 a month for your cable, you could pay $8 a month and just all you can eat Netflix. And who's paying the bill behind the scenes? Your internet provider, whose bandwidth you're sucking dry because you're sitting there and watching your 8 hours of TV at night, and it's coming off your internet bandwidth that they're sharing. Go ahead.
Is there kind of a defining line though? Because you live like out in the boonies, right? Like, isn't there kind of a defining line, a point where it's not like there is something to be said for not having available like a different companies that you can go to because of their setup or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
But isn't there also something to be said because he lives out in the middle of nowhere? He's limited to the types of technologies that he's able to use in order to get the internet in the first place.
Well, sure. So, we all have to be reasonable. For instance, if you live in the boonies, you're not going to expect that there's 4,000 options. Maybe within, let's say you live out in the middle of nowhere, maybe within reasonable driving distance of your house, you have a Ford and a Chevy dealership. Okay? If you want to look at Hondas, it might be a hike. Okay? We're not going to call that unreasonable. That's not really a monopoly. That's just economics, right? So he should still have some options. But, that's the whole idea why we don't want monopolies. Well, why we think we don't want monopolies. Good thing is that I kind of like small monopolies. I like there to be like two competitors. So I really like this idea that we kind of have, you could call it what you want, but it still is a monopoly between Apple and Google in terms of our smartphones. iOS, Android, we benefit as consumers because both of them exist. They keep one-upping each other, right? So our crap keeps getting better, regardless of which side you're on. Android every day gets better. iOS keeps stealing stuff from them. Android steals stuff from them. And we just keep getting better and better and better crap. But if we just had iOS or just had Android and the other guy didn't even exist, yeah, you could say, well, Apple keeps innovating stuff like that. Well, I don't care how innovative you are, you're going to start sitting on your laurels a little bit if you don't have anybody chasing you, right? So having, I think, a two-person monopoly, whether you want to call that a monopoly or not, I think is good. You get too many people in the water, then the competition gets, there isn't that clear leader. I like the two big companies that are just going at each other's throats constantly, just like in graphics cards, ATI and NVIDIA. Consumers, we get the best graphics cards out of that because they're just trying to make the other one go bankrupt at all times. That's what they're going for. But anyways, so this net neutrality thing was very interesting from the perspective of, I think the vote that was made was the fairest vote, but I think it potentially could negatively impact consumers' wallets rather than Netflix wallets.
How do you think, because they did also make it so that internet's going to be utility style, how do you think they're going to measure that?
Well, I mean, how else would you measure it? You'd measure it on total data.
I don't want them to do that.
What's the increment? Like, how are they going to price it?
Oh, I mean, I guess, does it matter? I mean, you can charge per bit. For electricity, you charge per kilowatt hour, right? If you use a fraction of a kilowatt hour, they charge you for a fraction of a kilowatt hour. So, I mean, you can, if you want to just be granular about it, they'll charge you per bit. So, your price per bit for your internet is 0.00001 cents or something like that, whatever the math comes out to. To keep our current, let's say your internet is $50 a month, maybe $50 a month buys you 30 gigabytes of data at home. Maybe that's reasonable. And I think a lot of people won't be affected by this. Right? I think a lot of people won't be affected because a lot of people don't go over 30 gigabytes a month. But the people who go over 30 gigs a month are those same people who are cutting the cord because it's cheaper. Why should I pay $80 a month for cable when I can get all the content I want for $8 a month from Netflix? Oh, by the way, now your internet bill just went up. So now you're right back to that $80 a month for the same content. See what I'm saying? So the consumers who want to cut the cord because everything's about penny pinching, and convenience. I mean, it is more convenient to just, and I used to do this. This is more of an ethical question. For instance, I've always had cable TV, like the top package that gives you all the channels. Well, a lot of times I would go online and I would download the TV shows that I watch because they would already have the commercials taken out of them. And I could watch them whenever I wanted. This was kind of before DVRs. Even during DVRs, but let's just say before DVRs. In my mind, I'm like, well, I paid for this content. Let's take House, the TV show House as an example. House was on all the time on the cable package I was paying for. Well, I chose to download it online from free sources where somebody had already taken the commercials out because it was a convenience for me. But in my mind, well, how am I being illegal? Because I have paid for that content. But I paid for it from these guys over here, not from these guys over here. That's like saying I ordered a CD off Amazon, but I ran into Target and stole it. Well, I bought it. So I bought it from them, but I'll steal it from them. But it's easy to rationalize stuff like that, I think. And, it's going to be interesting because I think the reason a lot of people cut the cord, so to speak, is to reduce their payment because all this stuff has been so convenient for us to digest out there. Well, now if we actually have to start paying for the data we're using, it might not be as great of a deal. Yeah.
Playing devil's advocate a little bit about the stealing the CD from Target. With like data though, it's not you don't. It's still in possession of the original person. You just copied it. So they still have their movie, and you now have a copy of the movie. So like if you steal the CD from Target, Target has one less CD that they can sell now because you stole it.
Sure.
But so I guess is it truly the same?
Well, no, I get it. I don't know that it's completely the same, but I think functionally it's still the same. That I was saying I deserve the content from here because I paid for the content over here. In this case, I'm not hurting them like I would be hurting Target in your example, but I'm still equating ownership here because I paid for it here, which doesn't necessarily make a lot of sense. So maybe it's one of those things where I could feel a little bit less guilty about it. And that's actually the world we live in. And we talk about this in our ethics course. Most of us in here have stolen at least one song before, right? We've downloaded an MP3 off the internet or something like that. Well, most of us in here have never gone into a store and stolen a CD. Why? Bigger chance of getting caught. Even though they're both theft, because the consequences, the consequences are the same, but the chance of having to face the consequences are so much slimmer stealing an MP3 or stealing an album online than running into Target and having to rely on your foot speed and how baggy your pants are. We tend to not do that, right? Even less so. I bet you the theft of music from stores is at an all-time low. Who's going to steal music from the store?
These days, they're just not stealing from
Yeah,
stores.
the people are just they're so honest, because they don't have to put pants on anymore to steal music. They can just do it from home. I don't know. So it becomes a very interesting thing. So it will be kind of eye-opening, I think, maybe over the next year, because this is not over, right? There's going to be the cable companies are going to start protesting, and you're going to have all this other stuff, and then there'll be hacker attacks. It'll be funny. It depends on what you needed to do that night, but there's going to be interruptions of services and stuff over the next couple of years. Well, at least next year, I would think, as this stuff kind of shakes out. But would you rather, as a consumer? I think I would. I would rather my bills stay low, and Netflix have to pay Comcast for the faster speed. Give them the fast lane, or have them pay something, and maybe any bandwidth that I use that's Netflix related gets forgiven. It's not related to my bandwidth total. So I'd rather the cable company be able to make an arrangement with Netflix, because Netflix having lots of consumers benefits their bottom line. Comcast having lots of consumers benefits their bottom line. But if these consumers are using a lot of bandwidth from Netflix, that's going to hurt Comcast's bottom line. So from a fairness perspective there, I think Comcast should be able to get their expenses covered from somebody. I'd rather it be Netflix than me. Does that mean that Bob's car wash website goes a little slower? I honestly don't care. Let the steerage on the internet's data travel slower. It's an elitist view. But from a consumer perspective, I'd rather pay less and have the internet become elitist than have, it could be the beginning of the end if we go that route, but at least in the short term, I think I'd prefer that as opposed to this big question mark as to, what's my internet bill going to go up to? Something like that. I watch a lot of Netflix. I also pay for Uverse, so I'm doing both. But I have my shows that I watch in my office on Netflix, but at least that's Concordia's internet, so I'm not paying for that. But so I watch a lot of episodes of TV shows on Netflix. I would say, I don't even know, 30 a week, 30 shows a week, probably 30 hours of content. That's a lot of data. And if each show is, I don't know, a gigabyte, let's say, of streaming, it's 30 gigs a week just from TV shows. And I'm streaming on Netflix. That's not even my other internet stuff. So I don't know, kind of an interesting thing. So we'll see who comes out ahead.
So you see like that short term but long term, do you think the net neutrality thing is a good idea?
I don't think it's as altruistic as people think it is. For instance, having the government having some say over what happens on the internet is really no better than having Comcast saying what happens on the internet. Okay, somebody, quote, evil is going to make our decisions for us regarding our network connections. And whether it's the government, whether it's Comcast directly or it's Comcast through lobbyists controlling the government, it's still going to happen. So really, this is kind of a moot point, I think, to some extent, which is why I think that we'd be better off just having it be transparent. And since the people are going to refuse to pay more. So at the end of the day, there's going to be, whether it's government sanctions or the government gives a kickback to Comcast for keeping prices below a certain level, the equivalent of Obamacare, but for internet. So whoever the next president is, come up with some catchy phrase. Catchy phrase for internet sanctions or something. I don't know. I think it'll be interesting. Stream of care? No, I don't think you put care on it. No. It didn't work that well the first time. So
the internet just put cats all over it and they're for it.
That's right.
Goats. Baby goats.
Yeah, but I mean, very interesting stuff, and still related to what we're talking about here, because everything's about who's paying for that data. Somebody's got to pay for it, because who's paying for that bandwidth? We have bandwidth that we're all sharing, but somebody's got to pay for that bandwidth. Having all these things connected together costs a lot of electrical power, a lot in hardware maintenance. There's all these costs associated with keeping the internet linked together. Okay, so even if we take a little local area network like here on campus, we have things plugged in all the time, so the power bill is going to be high. It takes electricity to run those things. Now, computers can't talk to each other unless there was electricity keeping the network equipment up and running. That's a cost. Okay. Now, if you're bringing in an external link to give us access to the internet, that's a cost. Because when we pay for that link from Time Warner or we pay for that link from AT&T, well, they're giving us access to the broader network, the internet that they have access to. At the same time, they're also sharing some of their bandwidth with us. So we get so much bandwidth from them. So we're paying a portion of their power bills and network maintenance and the people that are maintaining their networks. So all these things have costs associated with them. When I think consumers typically don't think about that. We typically don't. We just think, oh, an Ethernet cable, is $4. Done. That's done. So I paid my $4 once, and now as much data as I want to send over this guy, it's unlimited bandwidth. Well, that's all fine and dandy until it actually has to start going through switches and all this other stuff. Somebody's got to pay for it. So when we have consumers like these guys who are abusing the bandwidth, utilizing various technologies, things that and using it for things they didn't pay for. Okay, so I think, and this is where the blurry area comes in, is what's considered reasonable use. Like Concordia has an acceptable use policy. Most places have an acceptable use policy. What's considered to be reasonable in terms of acceptable use and unreasonable? Is it related directly to the size of the data? Is it the nature of the data? So, let's say you're at a university and you need to download a 20 gigabyte data set for some research you're working on. Those exist. In fact, those are some of the biggest files out there, are just huge, huge, huge collections of data that have been accumulated over the last several years or something from all these different data points somewhere. So I might be downloading a 20 gigabyte file, let's say, for doing some research. Is that acceptable use at a university? Sounds reasonable, right? It's researchy, university stuff, right? No big deal. But what if I was instead using that 20 gigabytes to download stolen episodes of Dancing with the Stars? 20 gigabytes is 20 gigabytes. So are we measuring acceptable use by the amount of data? Or are we measuring acceptable use by the nature of the data? We can apply the same thing. Forget about the internet. Apply the same thing to our printers here on campus. We're allotted so much paper, right? Okay, and we pay for per page beyond that allotment. Well, what if you go past your allotment because your teachers are giving you legitimate homework? Let's say you have a teacher just keeps giving you 20-page papers, and you're doing your homework, you're printing them out, you're through your paper allotment. Was that an acceptable use of a lot of paper? Sure. You might say, well, why isn't this guy just having us electronically turn it in? But you get what I'm saying. As opposed to you going into the lab and printing out a flyer for the new stupid business you're creating and running off 500 flyers that you're going to go put on people's cars over at Bayshore. Is that acceptable use? Either case, you use 500 pieces of paper. So, it becomes an interesting thing. Is it the nature or is it the amount? Yeah, I don't know the answer. The only people who can really answer are the ones who are currently paying the bill. And all they want is for somebody else to pay the bill. Yeah.
So with the net neutrality thing, how is that going to handle like bigger mergers like the Comcast Time Warner cable merger?
Oh, I don't think that's related. I think the net neutrality is a different issue than that.
Well,
that's an anti-monopoly type of.
Well, the net neutrality thing actually paved the way for the Time Warner Cable and Comcast merger because now it's technically not a monopoly because it's regulated. I just read it like a 3-page article.
Yeah, but I don't know. I mean, that I think that must be political speak for they might be able to make an argument. It's still going to have to go through the anti-monopoly legislation stuff. Can you have time? Well, it couldn't have this fast. Can you have Time Warner and Comcast in the same? Can they be owned by the same entity? Because now you have one cable provider for the entire country. Which now reduces our choices from 2 down to 1. Even though their argument would be that in none of the markets where Comcast exists is Time Warner a option, and in none of the markets where Time Warner exists is Comcast an option. So it doesn't really make it any worse. You still only have one option for cable providers in those areas. So is that you could argue it's a monopoly right now, and that's why we have these smaller mom and pop type cable companies, but only in small areas. You can't have a mom and pop cable company come into the Milwaukee area and think that they're going to compete with Time Warner. They'll get put out of business in 5 seconds. So, yeah, I could see there being one cable provider and have it be government regulated just like power, just like electricity is. If you're going to regulate not just internet, you're going to regulate, and I think, what's his name? Billionaire guy owns the Mavericks. Cuban, yeah, Mark Cuban. I think he had a thing about this net neutrality. There's a video up talking about bits or bits, whether we're delivering video through a television signal or we're delivering your downloaded internet from Netflix. Every bit is a bit. So how can we reasonably say that we're going to regulate your internet bits, but not regulate your television bits? So maybe what you do is you just regulate the entire thing and say, anything that's being electronically digested by your house, by your televisions, by your laptops, by your cell phones is a regulated resource, just like water, just like electricity. And I think people could say, okay, that's fair, as long as it's not too expensive. So that's that balancing act. So I guess we'll see. So I don't really have a problem with the cable companies merging if it becomes a regulated resource, because like We Energies is the Wisconsin energy thing, but they don't choose how much they charge for electricity.
Oh yeah, but I've seen in like other state by state basis, like in Indiana with NIPSCO, their major energy provider.
Mm-hmm.
There's no competition there, and they have a monopoly. But they continuously jack up the prices like on a regular yearly basis because they're improving infrastructure.
Right, but those prices are still regulated by the government.
They found ways through because if it's a state-based company and they don't cross states, which Comcast and Time Warner Cable may not be.
Okay, well, so you're saying they're regulated, but they find loopholes.
Yeah.
That's going to be every company. Just like our tax laws, the government makes our tax laws, and so you have your Congress that are making these things, and they're probably the ones that are illegally deducting as much as anybody. They create the loopholes so that they can take advantage and write off their house servants and stuff. So, it's
like gold-plated toilet bowl.
Yeah, whatever. It's somebody's. It's human nature. All this stuff ends up becoming human nature. It's not right or wrong. Just we're not happy unless we're getting things our way, whether it's fair or not.
Just have to start breaking into neighbors' Wi-Fi networks.
Well, I know we're out of time, so you can start packing up. But related to electricity, when I first moved up here, I live in a condo, and at some point in the past, when they must have either hooked up the electricity to my house or hooked it up to my neighbor or whatever, they flipped them. Okay? Well, so the previous people who are actually members of my church now that lived in my house, they probably used about the same amount of power as my neighbor, so nobody really noticed. Well, I come there, I got all this computer equipment and stuff. I'm like, man, my bills are so low. My neighbors are like flipping out. Like, our bills are $300 a month. They used to be 60. So after like 14, 15 months, the cable company figures it out. Or the power company figures it out. My neighbor comes over and he's like, yeah, we had these guys come out. We didn't want to, upset you, but they found out that the things were switched. And I'm like, no, I mean, why would I be mad at you? It's not your fault. They had it backwards. I mean, I was happy I wasn't having to pay that much, but I just thought, because I moved from Illinois to Wisconsin, I just figured, power must be cheap here. Didn't really think about it. Well, then the cable company, the electrical company made me pay back all the old stuff, even though it was their mistake, because it was federally regulated. Somebody had to pay for it. So they refunded my neighbor, which is fair, right? Why should they pay for electricity they didn't use? So then I just went outside and hooked everything up to theirs again. So
Yeah, if my neighbor had, Time Warner's,